Hi class, this is the next video in our series talking about methods and approaches for study. One of the things that is probably almost as important as knowing what you should do is to also identify those areas that maybe ought to be avoided. Not necessarily because they're wrong or bad or shouldn't be considered, but probably because they're either more difficult or more problematic or ones that just have a hard time being the approach used when doctoral research is being considered. So let's talk about what I like to call the 7 red flags. And these are red flags to your committee, to your professors. When they see some of these ideas identified in a concept paper, it sort of makes us read a little closer and say, all right, there's a lot of potential for problems here. Once again, that's not to say that these methods and approaches are not effective ones for researchers in certain situations. They are just ones that maybe for us in ITDE, Instructional Technology and Distance Education, we ought to think twice before we consider pursuing them. First of all, the staff development and training. Well, if you want to do staff development, that's what we do as instructional technology people. So it's probably not a good area for research, for science, for your doctoral dissertation. It's what we do as a consequence of our experience and our coursework, not what we conduct research on. And similar to that is the whole idea of technology integration. An important idea, but one that has been studied and overstudied over the last several decades. We know why people adopt and why people do not adopt instructional technologies, and certainly technology integration is an important problem in a professional sense, but probably not an issue that warrants doctoral level dissertation research, just because of it's been so overstudied in the past. Product development is another. Product development, when you say you're going to produce a series of classes, maybe online classes, you're going to adopt or adapt something. Once again, this is the practice of instructional technology and distance education, not the science of instructional technology and distance education. Actually developing something is what we do when we work in our field, probably not what we conduct research on. What we want is scientific principles that help us in product development rather than product development itself. Another area that maybe you're surprised to see are evaluations. Once again, an evaluation study, Stufflebeam or the AEIOU approach, are excellent research areas, research and evaluation, but often they're not done as comprehensively as they should be. In other words, we're talking about in-depth, long-term studies of a product or a project or an activity that we want to understand, maybe a case study of the impact of an online program over several years. Oftentimes when evaluation studies are proposed by doctoral students, they tend to be short-term. You know, I'm going to do a workshop and we're going to evaluate it to see what the teachers or the staff people thought about that workshop. That's not an evaluation study. That is evaluating. And so evaluation studies generally are long-term, they're comprehensive, they have multiple variables, and that makes them excellent. But the person who's proposing the evaluation needs to be aware of that's what they entail. Another one you may be surprised to see is surveys. Once again, survey research is an effective way to gather information from a disparate group of people. You have a population, you sample it, you get them to survey, use standardized instruments. The problem here is it is incredibly difficult to get a high enough return rate on your sample in order to make your research generalizable, which we'll talk about in the Magnificent Seven when we talk about what constitutes an effective dissertation. When we do survey research, if we don't have 50 to 70%, probably 70%, maybe as little as 50% of those whom we sample, let's say it's media specialists in the state of Iowa and there's 300 of them, if we don't get 200 returns, our results are increasingly meaningless. And the purpose of effective research is to have generalizable results, have meaning from what we studied. So surveys need to be proposed cautiously and after careful thought about how we're going to make sure that we're surveying enough people. Comparison study. You'll study, if you haven't already, a guy named Richard Clark, who has pretty much clarified that when we compare this form of technology to that form of technology, this medium to that medium, it probably is a fruitless study. We know that it's not the medium that makes a difference, it's the pedagogy, it's the content, it's the approach, rather than comparing one form of media to another. So we generally don't want to compare this classroom to that classroom, online to face, for example. And finally, when we see sophisticated statistics, regression analyses, or especially non-parametrics, chi-squares and others, Spearman-Rowe, that makes us as professors kind of sit back and say, well, now, wait a second. Do we really need those sophisticated statistics? And are you, as the person who writes a dissertation, in a place where you can understand those statistics so you can explain them in a meaningful way in your dissertation? So we found that most, certainly not all, but most of our studies, descriptive statistics and less sophisticated arithmetic and mathematical analysis of results probably isn't as needed as some might think. Anyway, these are what we call the red flags, not to say that you can't do any of these, but to kind of alert you that maybe we ought to be considering other approaches and other techniques and other methods as we propose our doctoral dissertation, which we're going to talk about in the companion video to this one, the Magnificent Seven. Thanks.